The message arrived on a perfectly ordinary evening. No warning, no long explanation. Just a few short lines, so cold that I had to read them twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. I was no longer expected at a momentous family occasion. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because there had been an argument. Simply because I was no longer part of their plans. I sat there for a long time afterwards. I didn't cry. I didn't call to ask why. But inside me, a feeling became unmistakably clear. It was as if something had quietly shifted long ago, and at last it had revealed itself. At that moment, I didn't do anything yet, but I knew if I didn't change, things would only get worse. I am a retired woman living alone in the old house I've known for years. I'm no longer young, and my life is no longer noisy or crowded. People often say I'm gentle, quiet, and easy to give in. That's why I'm usually seen as someone who will accept everything in silence. I'm not young anymore, but I'm not weak. I've just grown used to being quiet. If this story quietly touches you, it may be because you, too, have stayed silent for too long, just like I did. If you're looking for a place to slow down, to listen to stories that aren't about judging right or wrong, but about understanding ourselves more clearly, you can subscribe to this channel and stay with us. Here, we don't celebrate winning or losing. We learn together how to live more lightly, more kindly, and how not to let our hearts be hurt again. Before everything changed, my life was tranquil. Not the loud or dazzling happiness, but a steady sense of peace that comes when each day follows its natural rhythm. I had a long marriage. My husband was a man of few words, hardworking, not good at expressing affection, but always present when it mattered. We weren't wealthy, but we were never in want. The house I live in now is the one we built together, little by little, back when we were young. My children were always the center of my life. I wasn't a strict mother. I cared, I listened, and I often chose to stand quietly in the background. When my children were small, I was used to waking up early to prepare everything for them. When they grew older, I learned to speak less, so they wouldn't feel controlled. I believed that love didn't need many words, only steadiness and endurance. After my husband passed away, my life became smaller. The house was no longer filled with shared meals like before, but I kept my old routines. I tended the small garden behind the house, read in the evenings, and waited for calls from my children. There were moments when I felt empty, but I didn't call it loneliness. I thought of it as a natural phase of life, when you learn to slow down and to accept less. I have always believed in straightforward values. I thought that if you lived kindly and didn't harm others, life would not mistreat you. Not always smoothly, but fairly in its own way. I never said these things out loud to my children. I lived that way, thinking they would feel it on their own. There were years when I felt fortunate. My children grew up, found stable work, and built families of their own. I didn't ask for much. The occasional chance to sit together, share a simple meal, and listen to them talk about their day. That would be enough for the rest of my life. Looking back now, I understand that I lived with a sincere but also straightforward belief. I believed that whatever you give will come back to you, not in the same form, but in the way life chooses to arrange things, maybe sooner, maybe later, but never lost. That belief made it easy for me to give, easy to forgive, and sometimes too easy to stay silent when I should have spoken up. Back then, I didn't think much about boundaries. I thought the family didn't need calculations. I didn't realize that simplicity without awareness can become a weakness. But at that time, I truly believed I was living the right way, and I really was happy. Genuinely so. The changes didn't come suddenly. They came very slowly, so gently that if you weren't paying close attention, you could easily miss them. I missed them that way for a long time. After my child got married, their rhythm of life changed. That was normal. I knew that. I had prepared myself for it long before. They had a life of their own now, new priorities, and I was no longer the center the way I once had been. At first, the phone calls became less frequent. They didn't disappear entirely, just stopped being regular. Sometimes a week would pass, sometimes two. I told myself they must be busy. Work, a new family, new responsibilities. I remembered being in that stage myself. When you're young, you always think you have plenty of time ahead, so you don't rush to hold on to what you already have. The visits changed, too. Before, my child used to stop by often, even if it was to sit for a moment or eat a quick meal. Later on, everything had to be scheduled. Sometimes we'd make plans, then reschedule. Sometimes we'd reschedule, then cancel altogether. I grew used to hearing, "Let's do it another day," and to not asking any follow-up questions. I realized that I had begun living in a state of waiting, but a tranquil kind of waiting. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't complain. I lowered my expectations a little, then a little more. I comforted myself by thinking that my child was grown and couldn't revolve around their mother forever. Thinking that way made things easier, at least on the surface. There were moments when I felt the distance very clearly, not through words, but through the way my child listened. Shorter replies, fewer questions in return, less sharing. I knew there were worlds my child no longer brought home, and I didn't step into them. I stayed outside, like an old acquaintance who didn't want to intrude. I didn't ask much either, partly because I thought it wasn't necessary, but if I'm honest with myself, I have to admit that I didn't ask because I was afraid of the answers, fearful of learning that I was no longer as important as before, afraid of realizing there were spaces I could no longer fill, no matter how hard I tried. I chose silence and called it respect. I decided not to interfere and called it understanding. I believed that if I were patient enough, things would naturally find their balance again. Family bonds weren't so easily lost over a few minor changes, and I believed that silence was sometimes the best way to keep the peace. But silence, when it lasts too long, can turn into a habit, and that habit, if never examined, slowly leads people to accept things they once would never have considered normal. I didn't realize that at the time. I only felt myself gradually stepping back, very naturally, as if that were the place meant for me. Looking back, I don't blame anyone during that period. My child didn't do anything obviously wrong. I wasn't mistreated. Everything remained polite, calm, and orderly. Only one thing changed: the distance. And that distance didn't grow because of a single incident, but because of many small choices, many moments of silence, many times I told myself, "It's fine." At that point, I still believed I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being kind, accommodating, and not adding any burden to my child. I didn't know that being so gentle with my own sadness, consistently placing other people's feelings before my own, was quietly leading me toward a point where, later on, I wouldn't be able to step back any further. But that came later. At that time, I was still moving very slowly, very quietly, unaware that prolonged silence is sometimes not peace at all, but a sign that something is gradually slipping away. Helping began very naturally, almost without thought. At first, the amounts were small. Sometimes my child needed help managing a new plan. Sometimes they were short on money during a job transition. I listened and I helped, just as I always had. No records, no follow-up questions, no conditions attached. I believed that families shouldn't keep score. As long as I was able, I should help whenever I could. I also didn't want my child to worry more than necessary, especially during a time when they were building their own life. I often told them, sincerely, that if they needed anything, they should say so. At the time, I truly believed I was doing the right thing. Later on, the amounts grew larger, not because my child demanded more, but because the circumstances always seemed to come with reasonable explanations. I didn't question them. I didn't ask for detailed justifications. I listened and nodded. In my mind, a familiar thought occurred. If I could help now, my child would be more stable later. And once they were stable, everything would balance itself out. I didn't see it as a sacrifice. I didn't think I was losing anything. I still lived comfortably. Enough still spent modestly as before. Some expenses required more thought, but I never mentioned that. I didn't want my child to feel guilty. I believed that keeping them at ease was part of a mother's responsibility. Only later, when I had time to look back, did I begin asking myself questions I had once avoided. I realized that not everything I gave came purely from calm generosity. Part of it came from love. That was true. But there was another part, quieter and more challenging to admit. It was fear. I was afraid that if I could no longer help, I would slowly become less important. I was worried that if I said no, even once, the distance that already existed would grow wider. I didn't say these things to anyone. For a long time, I didn't even admit them to myself. I kept giving and called it family. I grew used to not asking questions, not asking when things might get better, not asking whether my child had any plans for the future. I told myself that asking would create pressure, and I didn't want to become a mother who made her child feel burdened, so I chose silence and let everything unfold on its own. There was one moment when I suddenly realized I was waiting for something, not waiting for the money to be returned, but waiting for something else. More frequent calls, a clearer sense of care, a feeling that I was still remembered. That realization startled me. For the first time, I began to understand something I had never considered before. I began to see that giving while still hoping to hold on to something is a form of attachment. Even if that expectation is small and carefully hidden, it still exists, and it keeps the heart from truly feeling light. I wasn't clear-headed enough to stop immediately, but in that moment I saw myself a little more clearly. I don't blame my child during this period. They didn't force me. They didn't make grand promises. Most of what happened came from my own initiative. I had grown so accustomed to the role of giver that I could no longer tell the difference between healthy support and placing myself in a position of vulnerability. Still, at that time, I believed everything would turn out fine. Family bonds were strong enough that no one would take advantage of anyone else. I felt that living kindly meant life would not betray me. I didn't yet understand that without clear boundaries, what I gave was slowly losing its balance. And when balance is lost, conflict doesn't need noise. It only requires time. That occasion was approaching quickly, so quickly that I had already begun preparing myself in my own mind, not preparing gifts or meals, but preparing for a familiar feeling, that I would be sitting with my family, even if only for a short while. I didn't expect much. I thought that, at the very least, I was still included, still present on days considered necessary. The message arrived in the afternoon while I was tidying up the kitchen. I remember it clearly because everything around me was quiet at that moment. The message wasn't long, no beating around the bush, just a brief notice that the plans had changed. This occasion would be for my child's immediate family. We could meet another time that's more convenient for you. There was no clear apology, no further explanation. The tone was polite enough that it couldn't be called rude, but cold enough for me to understand that I was no longer among their choices. I finished reading, set the phone down, and stood there for a long time without moving. I didn't call back. I didn't send another message. I didn't feel the need to ask why. In that moment, I understood that whatever the answer might be, it wouldn't make me feel any better. I felt one thing very clearly. I had just been set aside, gently but decisively. I sat down on the familiar chair by the window. The weather that day wasn't bad. The light was still soft. Everything went on as usual. Only inside me did something shift slightly. Not anger, not resentment, but a hollow feeling that was hard to name. I began thinking back on many things, not to place blame, but to understand why this hurt so much. I realized that the pain didn't come only from being excluded from a momentous occasion. It came from the fact that I had quietly attached too much meaning to my presence in other people's lives. I had grown used to measuring my worth by how needed I was, by what I could still provide, whether I was still invited, still asked, still remembered. I hadn't noticed it when everything was going smoothly. Only when I was pushed aside did I see clearly that I had handed over the right to define my value to others, without realizing when it had begun. I didn't cry right then. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I sat there and let the feeling pass through me. For the first time in a very long while, I didn't try to justify anyone's actions. I also didn't search for reasons to comfort myself. I looked straight at the truth. Relationships change not because of a single major event, but because of many small things accumulating over time. In that quiet moment, a thought surfaced clearly, not loud, but impossible to ignore. I realized that the deepest pain wasn't being left out. It was that I had grown accustomed to placing my worth in other people's hands. And if I continued that way, then whether I was included or excluded from any occasion, I would never truly feel at peace. After that day, I didn't make any decisions. I also didn't talk about it with anyone right away. If I rushed into doing something, it would likely be a reaction rather than a response rooted in understanding what I truly needed. So I stopped. In the nights that followed, I slept very little. Not because I was overly anxious, but because my mind was full of thoughts that hadn't yet settled into order. I lay still in the darkness, listening to the ticking clock, letting my emotions surface little by little. I didn't try to push them away. I didn't force myself to think positively either. I realized that I was angry about being excluded, angry about not being told sooner, furious about the feeling of no longer being important. At the same time, I felt deeply hurt, quietly, profoundly. Not hurt by any single sentence, but by the long silence that had led to this moment. I observed those emotions the way one observes the weather. Sometimes they intensified, sometimes they softened. I didn't try to judge right or wrong. I acknowledged that this was how I felt and that it was real. But I also knew one thing very clearly. If I acted right then, while my heart was still full of anger and disappointment, whatever I did afterwards would carry those emotions with it. I've lived long enough to know that decisions made in a troubled state of mind rarely lead to good outcomes. Not because they are always wrong, but because they often leave consequences that take a long time to untangle later. I didn't want to create new knots while the old ones were still unresolved. One thought kept returning during those days, soft but unmistakable. If I acted out of anger, I would only be adding more confusion, not for others, but for myself. I didn't want to carry that confusion any longer. I was tired of holding my heart in a tight grip to endure, so I allowed myself to become still. I walked more slowly. I ate more simply. I spent time sitting quietly by the window, watching things unfold without intervening. In that silence, I began to sense a small space opening inside me. Not answers, just the clarity that before doing anything at all, I needed to keep my heart from being swept away by reaction. I didn't know what I would do next, but for the first time in a long while, I knew one thing for sure. I would not let essential decisions be made out of anger and hurt. This time, at the very least, I wanted to act from a calmer place. After those days of settling myself, I began thinking about what needed to be done next, but no longer with the same suffocating state of mind as before. I no longer wanted to react to prove something. I tried to understand my situation clearly, thoroughly, and honestly. I realized that if I didn't clarify things for myself, I would continue living in a state of ambiguity, giving, getting hurt, hoping, and feeling disappointed at the same time. I started with very concrete steps. I reviewed the documents I had signed, the amounts I had helped with. I didn't do this with the mindset of checking up on or doubting anyone, but to look back at what had happened. I realized that for many years, I had been used to acting based on trust and affection, to the point that I hadn't noticed how I had placed myself in a very vulnerable position if things didn't unfold the way I believed they would. I also spent time learning about the legal aspects, not to prepare for a confrontation, but to understand where I stood. I didn't want to continue acting in uncertainty. I needed clarity. First and foremost, for myself. I didn't rush. I read. I asked questions. I listened. Every step was carefully considered, not out of fear, but because I didn't want to create more confusion. There were moments when looking at the numbers and the paperwork made me feel sad, not because of loss, but because I realized how lenient I had been with things that required boundaries. I didn't blame myself. I acknowledged that I had done the best I could with the understanding and capacity I had at that time. And now I needed to do the best I could for myself at this point in my life. I defined my goal very clearly. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I didn't want to hurt anyone further. I wanted things to be put back in their proper place, transparent, clear, without ambiguity, without half measures. I no longer wanted to live with the feeling of having to guess other people's intentions or wait for their kindness. There was one thing I kept reminding myself throughout this process. I wasn't doing this to make them suffer. I was doing it so that I would stop making myself suffer. That difference was crucial. It helped me keep my tone steady when speaking. It helped me remain calm when facing possible reactions. And more importantly, it helped me preserve the values I had lived by for so many years. I also prepared myself for misunderstandings. I knew that when things became clearer, some people might be unhappy. There might be blame and strong emotions. I didn't wish for that, but I was no longer as afraid of it as I had been. I understood that not every reaction is a sign that I've done something wrong. Sometimes it's simply a response to having to face boundaries for the first time. Throughout this period, I kept my daily rhythm steady. I didn't let the process of reviewing and organizing everything consume my mind. I still ate regularly, still went for walks, still maintained small routines that kept me grounded. I knew that if I allowed myself to become tense again, then even the right decisions would carry heavy energy. I didn't call this a battle. I didn't see myself as a winner or a loser. I saw it as a necessary step to give myself back the peace of mind I had traded away for too long in the name of accommodation. I didn't know where things would ultimately lead, but this time, I knew I was acting from a very different place. One without anger, without pleading, guided only by clarity and self-respect. And for me, that was enough to keep moving forward. The confrontation happened not long after. It wasn't in a dramatic, tense setting, like in the movies, but rather a conversation that appeared quite ordinary. Familiar voices, no raised tones, yet beneath it all were many unnamed emotions. I sensed that from the very beginning, and I also knew I needed to keep my inner balance from being pulled out of balance. The reproaches came first, not in a harsh tone, but wrapped in disappointment and logic, that I had changed, that I was making things complicated, that I no longer understood their situation the way I used to. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let those words pass through me, just as I had let so many other words pass through my life before. Then came the softer blame, no less heavy for being gentle, that if I weren't so sensitive, if I didn't think so much, if I had just let things stay the way they were, none of this would have happened. I recognized something very familiar. When boundaries are set, they are often seen as the cause of conflict rather than the result of long-standing accumulation. Emotional pressure came last, not stated outright but clearly felt, reminders of family bonds, of sacrifice, of the idea that I was a mother, an elder, and therefore should be more generous. I had softened before words like these. I had blamed myself whenever I thought about saying no. But this time, I didn't respond according to my old habits. I didn't argue. I also didn't try to explain too much, not because I lacked reasons, but because I realized that in conversations like this, The more you say, the easier it is for things to drift away from what truly matters. I said only what needed to be said, in an even, unhurried voice. I didn't justify my decisions. I repeated that I needed clarity so I wouldn't keep getting hurt. There were moments when I saw the expression on the other side change, from irritation to surprise, then to confusion. Perhaps they were used to me giving in, used to me stepping back to keep the peace. My calmness this time wasn't the same as my former silence. It wasn't avoidance. It was full presence, without confrontation. I realized something very clearly throughout that exchange. I didn't need to be understood right away. I didn't need others to agree with me to feel I was right. I only needed to keep my inner state from being disturbed further. When I stopped trying to be understood, I began to feel at peace. The feeling was different, lighter, more transparent. Certain words made me falter for a brief moment, not because they were true, but because they touched the softest part of me. But I had learned to pause just before reacting. I breathed. I reminded myself that if I let emotion take the lead, I would return to the old cycle, and I didn't want that anymore. The conversation ended without a clear conclusion. No one apologized. No one entirely gave in. But something had changed. I no longer walked away feeling I had done something wrong for voicing my needs. I no longer carried the familiar heaviness in my chest. On the way home, I felt tired, but not confused. I knew that maintaining integrity in moments like that isn't easy, but I also knew that if I kept living to please everyone except myself, I would never truly find peace. This time, I didn't defeat anyone, but I also didn't let my heart lose. And to me, that was a profound change. After that confrontation, I didn't try to learn anything more. I didn't ask anyone else. I didn't look for updates on how their lives were unfolding, not because I had grown cold, but because I understood that once I chose to reset my boundaries, continuing to watch from afar would only keep my heart entangled. I heard bits and pieces here and there, not by seeking them out, but not by avoiding them either. Ordinary things. Every day matters. Everyone has their own difficulties to deal with. Nothing was shocking. Nothing made me stop and dwell on it longer. I didn't use those bits of information to weigh or measure anything, nor did I use them to comfort myself or make comparisons. I realized that each person has to walk their own path. Whatever choices are made will eventually lead to corresponding consequences. No one needs to judge. No one needs to push. Life is already clear enough in the way it works. The most significant difference was my own reaction. Before, I might have been preoccupied. I wondered whether things would have turned out differently if I had done this or that. But now, I no longer follow those loops. I didn't carry other people's share. I also didn't hold myself responsible for things beyond my control. I turned my attention back to my own life. Small things, very ordinary, but enough to keep me rooted in the present. I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I didn't need to wait for a clear ending to decide whether I was right or wrong. There was one thing I understood very clearly at this stage. Consequences don't need to be pushed along. They unfold on their own. Everyone is learning their own lessons at a pace they can bear. I didn't wish for anyone to stumble. I didn't want anyone to pay a price. I only knew that my part was to keep my heart from being drawn into things that no longer belonged to me. And from the moment I chose to stand still in that place, my life became lighter, quietly so. Change didn't arrive through a single major decision or a sudden awakening. It came more slowly, more quietly, the way an old habit fades when it is no longer fed. I didn't wake up one morning feeling completely released. I noticed, over time, that certain things no longer weighed on me the way they once had. The first thing I let go of was the image of my children that I had held onto for far too long. The image of a child who is always grateful, always returns, always puts family above everything else. I understood that this image wasn't wrong, but it was my wish, not my child's obligation. By clinging to that image, I had unknowingly created a gap between reality and expectation, and it was that gap that caused my pain. I also gradually let go of the desire to be recognized. I stopped waiting for a moment of realization. I stopped hoping that one day someone would look back and say that I had been right. I realized that if my peace depended on whether others acknowledged me, I would always be in a state of waiting. And waiting over a long period of time is a kind of exhaustion I no longer wanted to carry. As those things were released, even partially, I began returning to my own life, not by starting over, but by continuing to live with fuller presence. I paid attention to the small things I used to rush through: a meal, a quiet morning, a conversation that didn't require me to brace myself. I no longer defined my value by being a mother. I am still a mother, but I am also a woman with her own life, her own thoughts, her own limits, and the right to live more lightly. When I allowed myself to stand in that place, I didn't feel more selfish. I felt more real. There is a sentence I often repeat to myself during this stage. Whenever my mind drifts back to old attachments, letting go is not losing. Letting go is returning everything to its proper place, returning children to their own lives, returning responsibility to those who should carry it, and returning peace to myself. I am not entirely free, but I know one thing, for sure. I am no longer bound by expectations that exhaust my heart. And since I began letting go, my life hasn't become wider, but it has become deeper, not louder, but fuller. Looking back on this entire journey, I don't think I did everything right. I also don't believe that the path I chose is the only one or the best one for everyone. I only know that it was the path that fit me at that time, when I no longer wanted to keep living with a quiet exhaustion I couldn't even name. If you were in my place, you could. You could endure a little longer. You could talk things through more, or you could walk away sooner than I ever did. Everyone has a different threshold, and no one has the right to judge another person's choice, especially when they have never lived that life themselves. The only thing I learned, and the only thing I want to hold on to, is honesty with myself. Honesty about my feelings. Honesty about my limits. Honesty about how much I can still bear and where it becomes too much. When I began being honest in that way, I no longer needed to win against anyone, nor did I need to prove anything. My life now isn't more perfect than before. There are still empty days, still moments of missing and sadness, but I no longer feel stretched tight between expectation and disappointment. I live more slowly and more lightly, not because everything has worked itself out, but because I no longer add extra weight to myself. I'm sharing this story not so that you follow my path. I only hope that by the time you reach this point, you might pause for a moment and ask yourself where you are placing your own value, in the recognition of others or in your own sense of peace. You may choose differently from me, but if today, even just a little, you live a little lighter, understand yourself a little more, and blame yourself a little less, then for me, this story has been enough.